Welcome to this fourth class in environmental security. This week, the topics include food security, water, and migration. It's a teaser class that introduces you to topics that we'll get into more deeply over the course of the semester. For each of these topics, I try to link physical effects of environmental change to social effects to then the follow-on security consequences. This is a bit of a melange of topics, but what they may have in common is they follow some intermediate pathways and mechanisms that connect environmental change passing through food production or issues associated with water scarcity or wider physical effects of migration and how that then can translate into security consequences and then what to do about it. I wanted to pick up a topic that we didn't quite finish last time, which was the policy turn to understanding and appreciation of climate security risks. We ended off last week's lecture talking about the new Climate for Peace report, which came out in 2015 from the German think tank Adelphi for the G7. And that document had a notable transition in thinking about how responses to climate change could be sources of conflict as important and profound as the physical effects of climate change itself. And here, thinking about responses like geoengineering or land grabs. That was a part of the policy turn that we talked about last week. I wanted to situate that in the broader interest in both what are the appropriate policy responses to climate security risks and also what our policy audience is worried about and how that's similar or different to what academics were worried about. As you recall, academics are focused narrowly in much of this literature on the connections between whether proxies for climate change are associated with the onset or incidence of violence. And in terms of the question that I posed a moment ago about the appropriate policy responses to climate security risks, there are a couple of different things. One is the first lines of defense to deal with climate security risks are often in the developmental space. So the kinds of things that we talked about as appropriate policy responses include risk assessments, efforts to improve food security, efforts to improve disaster risk reduction, transboundary water dispute resolution mechanisms, supporting local resilience. All of these sound like they're firmly in the developmental bucket of institutions and approaches and less squarely in the response of militaries. And what I noted is that if these ultimately become problems that rise to the level or in the job jar of militaries, then all of these other civilian side interventions have likely failed. And that's in and of itself is a sign that many things have gone wrong. In terms of the question about are policymakers concerned with the same things as academics, I noted that policymakers have a wider set of concerns than conflict. They're interested in whether or not climate risks contribute to conflict, but they're interested in a host of other things as well, such as impacts on militaries, the increased demands for militaries to participate and respond to domestic emergencies, supporting civilian authorities, those same demands for addressing international emergencies for humanitarian purposes. They're also worried as well about these responses to climate change like geoengineering and whether or not that will contribute to instability or conflict. They're increasingly taking an interest in the geopolitical context of mitigation as the issue set increased in salience and became a matter of high politics. And that may play itself out in particular in the clean energy transition, increasing contestation over critical minerals. So while policymakers are concerned about the conflict risks associated with climate change, they have a host of other concerns that they're worried about as well. And These sets of concerns were documented in the Defense Climate Risk Analysis report that I contributed to when I worked at the Pentagon from 2021 to 23, and noted in that document that we were concerned about the impacts on bases, the impacts on training, the impacts on military missions, how climate risk could complicate the ability for the U.S. military to get access, basing, and overflight rights to particular country contexts, that climate risk could destabilize allies and partners, and then in turn, the climate changes could have transnational cascading impacts on food and migration, among the topics that I'm going to turn to next. The first topic this week was food security, and we started by trying to establish the links between climate change, food production, and then security, starting with climate impacts on food, looking at the social effects of disrupted food production, then the possible security outcomes associated with those social effects, and then what to do about it. In terms of climate impacts on food production, there are two discrete pathways that we noticed. One was the potential for agricultural declines as a result of drought, rainfall volatility, and flood events that may disrupt agricultural production in countries that have large farming sectors. That in turn could undermine agricultural livelihoods, contributing to the pathways we talked about last week, the increased attractiveness of participating in rebel movements, the decreased ability of states to provide services and repress violence. There may be other social effects like the increased willingness of people to engage in riots and strikes. There's also just the general matter of insufficient food production that could increase the risks of famine in societies if not enough food is grown locally and there aren't other compensatory mechanisms to provide food for them. That's a pathway that we talked about last week in detail as we were thinking about climate security links and these pathways to violence of these intervening paths. The one that we hadn't really talked about last week that we spent a lot of time on was the possibility for those impacts on agricultural areas to be more at the global level and less at the local level. So there could be agricultural disruption as a result of climate change in, say, Patagonia, and the impacts on wheat production are such that global food prices could rise. And in countries that find themselves particularly dependent upon imported grains, they may find their populace facing increased food prices. And the impacts of increased food prices were associated in the period after the Arab Spring, has contributed to the protest events that ultimately led to different governments being toppled with these social movements that emerged at the time. And so some of the works that we assessed this week looked at those connections between food price spikes and riots, strikes, and other forms of protest activity. I'll talk more about those two studies that we referenced this week in a second. Even before we got into the security consequences of food price spikes, we looked at another paper by Iglesias and her colleagues to examine what potential impact climate change could have on food production around the world, and looking at both physical effects of agricultural productivity and the adaptive capacity of different countries. And their study, which is a bit dated, but it gives us some point of departure, suggests that Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia were likely to have the largest decreases in agricultural productivity looking out under a high emission scenario to 2080, that parts of North America, Northern Europe, and even Russia might have flat productivity or even increased productivity as new lands open up to arable agriculture, at least in the high north or further north, their latitudes. Other regions of the world, like Australia, would have slight negative impact, and the Middle East would also have a fairly significant negative impact. That's in terms of agricultural land productivity. But there are ways in which countries can insulate themselves from these effects if they have highly adaptive societies. And this particular paper looked at the combination of natural capacity, economic capacity, social capacity, and agricultural innovation. So this is a combination of wealth, um, education levels, innovation, and some other metrics. And when you look at the relative adaptive capacity in different societies under different scenarios, the countries like Australia or China had a limited drop off in agricultural productivity, or at least given their adaptive capacity to be able to withstand some of these impacts. And other countries like Syria, Zimbabwe, India, there were greater concerns that under high emission scenarios and low adaptive capacity that they would fare worse. The upshot of these observations was that Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia would be at the highest risk of agricultural disruptions, and even Central America, which faced mild decreases in agricultural productivity, faced higher risks in terms of adaptive capacity and might fare worse under high emission scenarios relative to the effects on other parts of the world, like North America, Europe, and even China and Russia. So we noted that food price hikes in the 2010s was associated with the onset of the Arab Spring political protests in North Africa and the Middle East. And the paper we read from Todd Smith was reacting to associations that were drawn by Loggy and others that the price increases globally in 2008, 2009, and later in 2011 could be associated with those protest activities in the region, and in turn was followed by state repression that led to a number of deaths. Now, Todd Smith's paper questioned that causal logic partially by suggesting that a number of states actually insulate their publics from those global food price hikes through subsidies and other policies that blunt the price increases at the global level. Those aren't actually observed locally. And he was able to determine that when you try to map onto the local food price increases, that indeed is associated with increases in protest activity. But as he noted, some states are able to use subsidy policy so that that if those food price hikes ultimately do occur, it may happen a little later and may not be coterminous with the changes that are happening at the global level. This is a challenging trajectory to actually document the impact of local food price hikes on protest activity, in part because there can be feedback mechanisms so that protest activity can actually contribute to price hikes in food. And so the way he sought to get at this is by looking for a third variable that couldn't be affected by protest activity, but was associated with changes in local food prices. And to do that, he used what's called an instrumental variable approach, and he used rainfall data. Rainfall data can affect food prices at the local level, but cannot be in turn affected by protest activity. In other words, protest activity cannot cause rainfall to change. So this instrumental variable approach allows one to get at the micro foundations of the influence of domestic food price change by using an instrumental variable to see how that rainfall data affects local food price hikes, and in turn assess the impact on increases in protest activity. And so this isolation strategy, it allows him to show that each additional percentage point increase in the domestic consumer food price index leads to a 24% increase in the odds of unrest. And that goes up even higher if their food prices increase by a greater amount. And so this suggests that a qualification on the argument that was offered by Loggy and others about the way global food prices are translated into local markets. And indeed, those subsidy policies can be quite important in at least blunting or delaying the effects of global food price hikes, and may not be transmitted at the local level in some societies at all. We read another paper that also looks at the connections between local food price increases and political unrest. And here, the mechanism varies by regime type. So if there are democratic societies, there's a greater likelihood that protest activity is seen as acceptable as a form of free expression. If it's an authoritarian regime, it's less likely that political expression is allowed, and so protest activity is seen more as a threat to the state and is repressed. And there's also variation in the kinds of representation, given that in the mass of people in democratic societies are farmers, then the state is less likely to be responsive to the needs of an urban minority who might be affected by food price hikes, but instead is interested in protecting the interests and welfare of the majority of citizens for whom politicians depend on for re-election. And so in societies where there are a large number of farmers, the state is less likely to offer subsidies for urbanites to protect them from food price hikes, and that in turn may lead to greater amounts of protest activity in those societies. Whereas in authoritarian regimes, they are more reliant on urban dwellers' political support for being able to stay in office, and so protests from urban dwellers might lead to coup attempts or others, and so they're willing to subsidize food for minority urban populations to prevent the risk of violent regime turnover. So we should expect to see both repression of protest activity, but also higher subsidies. And that indeed is what he finds in his research. And so we may expect that sort of climate-related disruptions that lead to food price hikes will have differential effects by regime type. In another work, he introduces another category of regime type, which is neither democracy nor authoritarian. They're sort of intermediate categories of what are called anocracies, that are sort of incomplete democracies, incomplete authoritarian governments that are on certain rating scales, not fully democratic and not fully authoritarian. In those societies, states lack the coercive capacity to repress political protests, and they may also lack the capacity to do as much service delivery to provide subsidies either. And so you may end up with situations where there's considerable protest activity in those societies from urban dwellers who are affected by price hikes. The final issue that we talked about is what should be done given climate-related disruptions to food production and food prices. And here, the kinds of measures that we're talking about are mostly interventions in the development space. If it becomes something that's a military problem, lots of other things have failed. So we're talking about early warning systems that can advise on the risk of famine, like Famine Early Warning Systems Network, or the Integrated Phase Classification Scheme for Famine Risk from the United Nations. We talked about technological improvements in the productivity of agriculture, maybe intensive, not extensive agriculture, so again, related to productivity enhancements. There may mean that in some places that agricultural livelihoods are no longer viable, and there needs to be a transition to off-farm forms of work. So what other kinds of ways are there for people to make a living in different places? Is it manufacturing? Is it services? What is it? If we still think that agriculture is viable, are there ways to climate proof it or make it more climate resilient with drought resistant varietals or other kinds of ways to make agriculture more efficient given more variable rains, for example? There could be increased support for local food markets, including infrastructure and other ways to ensure there's less waste and spoilage of food, so that whatever food's grown is actually ends up being used and not rotting in warehouses. There's also efforts to improve buffer stocks and insurance mechanisms. So in case there is a disruption in food supply, there are ways to compensate and provide people with food, or provide farmers with sources of income so that they can be made whole given if there are climate-related disruptions. There may be instances in which there's a disruption in growing conditions in one country and they impose export restrictions, and so they don't export grains to other countries, and that can be really especially disruptive to food importing nations. So are there efforts to try to continue exports despite some harvest reductions? And that can be challenging given if there are food needs in other societies, but trying to ensure that there are adequate supplies of food if there are overlapping disruptions in global food markets from, say, simultaneous harvest failures in several countries. These are among the different efforts as the sort of entry points for reducing the challenges associated with climatic disruption to food production and food price hikes. But if those efforts fail, there may be more emergency measures and efforts to deal with the conflicts that ensue. But again, if it comes to that, that's a real failure. The next issue we talked about was the connections between water and security. And here, these are similar in that the disruptions from climate change can lead to drought, more variable rains, more floods. And most of those effects work through agriculture in terms of decreased or hard to predict supplies of water, or even too much water. The pathway that we explored here that was a little different is thinking about the impacts on other users of water, like drinking water, industrial uses, power uses. And then the second dimension that we spent a lot of time on was thinking about interstate contestation over transboundary rivers. And that's something that's gotten a lot of press as we think about what are the social effects of climate change on transboundary rivers. And there's often been mooted the risk of water wars between countries over more scarce rains and more scarce rivers. Is that a real thing? And that's one of the issues that we talked about in this section of the class. I'm going to focus on that in my video comments because I think we've adequately addressed the agricultural linkages in the previous discussion on farming, other than to say that there are most of the models suggest that there are parts of the world that are likely to expose to increasing water scarcity, and some of those places are not simply countries in the global south. It often includes places in the global north, including, say, the southwestern parts of the United States. So water scarcity isn't simply an issue of development. It's likely to affect industrialized countries as well. But when it comes to this issue of will there be water wars, the evidence suggests that those purported risks, at least historically, are not borne out by what has happened. That most cases historically where there has been water stress between countries have been able to be handled relatively peacefully. Now, there may be a few instances of this, but uh, water wars, to the extent that we can find instances of militarized disputes between states over water, are relatively rare, and that most of the evidence that Aaron Wolf and colleagues at Oregon State point to suggests that these issues can be resolved peacefully. And maybe that's a function of the fact that water is essential for life, and maybe brings states together in imperfect water sharing agreements that are sometimes inequitable, but nonetheless are able to be resolved peacefully. And the classic example is Pakistan and India water sharing agreement on the Indus that has held up for more than 50 years, and they fought wars about other things, but not about water. The challenge, though, is that in a world of climate change, that it's less clear that those kinds of potential disputes can be headed off peacefully. And so there has been real concern about, say, the Grand Renaissance Dam between Ethiopia that's being constructed by Ethiopia, and what that means for Egypt downstream, that gets a large share of its agricultural needs for water from the Nile. And there are other instances like that where it's less clear that a world of climate change with more constrained water supplies will allow these disputes to be resolved peacefully. And so the work that Wolf and others have talked about is the need for more river basin water sharing institutions that can allocate water between different users, deal with shocks to water supplies, resolve disputes, and ultimately settle these issues peacefully. That there are many basins, particularly in Africa, that are under-institutionalized, that have weak or absent river basin water sharing agreements, and that there are other basins that are at great risk of potential conflict, in part because one state has unilaterally done some upstream dam building that could divert river resources, and at a time when there's increasing scarcity. And so those are dangerous moments that without adequate institutions, you could end up with conflict scenarios. And so that's the upshot of the conversation on the risk of water wars. There haven't been many or any historically, although some scholars like Peter Glick have suggested there have been more risks of conflicts in some locations. That may be true historically. There have been limited number of water wars, but it's not clear that that will hold up in a world of increasing water scarcity and variability with climate change. So like the discussion on agriculture, we also talked about what needs to be done to address these risks of increasing water scarcity and variability in a world of enhanced climate change. And so some of that has to do with basic information about what's going on in different river basins and in different societies at risk of disruptions in water supplies. Some of that also has to do with enhanced institutions to manage water. And that's true both within countries and between countries. And so that's an obvious implication that flows out of this work. And we see that in the US with the Colorado River, for example, and efforts to deal with increasing water scarcity in the US context. So it's not unique to countries in the global South. There's also ultimately got to be better technology to reduce waste. There's often considerable leakage in water systems around the world. There's over irrigation. There can be enhanced drip irrigation. There can be new technologies that can be made more affordable, like desalinization, so that countries at risk of water scarcity, particularly for potable water, will have alternative sources. There's also a need to deal with the effects of too much water, which might be, disaster resilient infrastructure. Ultimately, there may need to be better price signals, and this can be difficult as we think of water as a human right, but in certain aspects for industrial users, for example, pricing mechanisms that discourage water wastage may be important, and we have to think about how to balance the need to send the correct signal to users not to waste water, but also ensure that people's basic needs are met. The final topic we discussed this week were the links between environmental change, migration, and security outcomes. And again, this is one of the intermediate pathways that came up last week in our discussion of climate and security, that environmental change can decrease agricultural livelihoods and livestock production, or lead to humanitarian emergencies that force people on a temporary short-term basis to evacuate from their homes and move to other areas, or potentially can lead to more long-lived permanent movements of people as they move away from areas affected by environmental change that renders their original home uninhabitable, or less able to support them, either because it's too dangerous or it's difficult to continue their livelihoods. And so we're worried about similar things that we discussed in previous examples on agriculture and water. We're worried about humanitarian emergencies and the risks of famine, or the risk of death from exposure to the elements, and the need for military mobilization to perhaps rescue them from harm, from imminent death. We're also worried about the potential for conflict to emerge between the new migrants and the receiving populations. And then there are questions in the literature about what is the likelihood that migrants themselves might be involved in conflict or protest activity, or to what extent is the potential for conflict a function of how receiving populations accept them or not? Are there differences in kin, clan, ethnicity, religion, vocation that might lead to competition for resources and sources of division that mean that host populations and migrant populations come into conflict? That can be internal within countries, or it could be cross-border to the extent that those movements are across international borders. That's not to say that all these links are necessarily true. It's the question. And we also want to acknowledge that some actors see that the movements of people across borders in and of themselves are conceived of as security threats, though I'm not sure that's necessarily true, even if some actors believe that's so. In the discussion that follows, we discuss how migration is conventionally understood, how environmental change can alter those dynamics on migration, the potential linkages to security consequences, and what to do about this issue set. Classic stereotypes of migration is that it tends to be short distances of people moving within countries from rural to urban areas, tend to be men, and their motivations are mostly economic in nature. In a world of climate change, the kinds of migration may start to change to the extent that some areas may become increasingly uninhabitable or less favorable for agriculture, and that may lead to more permanent migrations and more instances of whole families picking up and moving and leaving. While it can be difficult to discern whether or not climate is the driver of migration in some circumstances, in other instances that may be clearer. For example, after swift onset disasters, people dislocated by a flood or a cyclone, it's pretty clear that that is the driver of migration. It may even be clear in the instances of long-running droughts that that is contributing to migration movements. And so those forms of distress migration may be more easy to attribute to climate-related disruptions, although long-run changes in, say, drying patterns outside of the context of drought may have a more subtle effect on people's movements when combined with other factors. And we may be able to identify in advance the kinds of places that are likely to be affected by this climate-related migration. Dryland areas of the world that are subject to even drier conditions, say in the Sahel Band, for example. Heavily populated coastal zones that are subject to enhanced cyclone and storm surge risks. Atoll countries, low-lying island nations that are affected by sea level rise and storm surge and salinization of water supplies. One other point that we raised is that there may be instances of trapped populations in that the people most likely to move are not necessarily the most vulnerable, but people with means may have more resources to get out. And so part of the challenge in thinking about how to address the problems associated with migration is not simply to think about the populations who are moving, but the populations who stay as well. One of the ideas that's important to acknowledge is that climate change may lead to some places like low-lying island nations to become increasingly uninhabitable. And the question is, will they be forced to contemplate what's called managed retreat, where they have to abandon either whole islands or whole countries? And this isn't unique to low-lying island nations. We see this in off the coast of North Carolina, for example, or in the coast of Louisiana. And so some communities may find it increasingly challenging for them to continue to stay in those locations. Again, we have to acknowledge that migration is a legitimate coping strategy for people to try to support their lives and livelihoods by moving to places that have better opportunities, that are safer for them. And so migration isn't always a bad thing, and we have to be mindful of that. Sometimes there are terms bandied around like climate refugees, and there's a question about, is that a useful term? Refugees has a very specific legal meaning, which generally refers to people suffering from political persecution. And we know that asylum rules and other rules related to refugee protection are under tremendous strain, not just in the United States, but other countries as well. So the difficulty of assessing whether or not someone is motivated to move by climatic reasons can be quite difficult, and it's maybe not helpful given the strain that the wider refugee system is under to try to invent a new category of legal protection when the basic one is under threat. But it may be important to identify a certain category of obvious climate migrants who need some legal protections, but maybe another word and another form of legal protection is necessary to help them. As we think about what to do about the security consequences of climate-related migration, again, we have to try to use information to enhance our understanding of where those risks are likely to be concentrated. And we can start with both early warning systems and identification of key at-risk locations and contingency planning. And that may well include thinking about whether or not managed retreat from some locations is going to be necessary. To avoid that situation from happening, it's incumbent upon vulnerable places to have the resources and support to invest in climate resilient infrastructure so that they are less susceptible to harm. And that's another strategy that can insulate them and help diminish the likelihood that they'll have to embrace managed retreat as the only path forward. There may be other strategies related to how people handle increased challenges of making a living in dryland areas, for example. So are there drought resilient agriculture possibilities or other forms of income diversification? We've talked about those policy solutions earlier in the class today. And ultimately, there may need to be new pathways to allow for cross-border migration. There have been some experiments with visas for climate-related migrants in the Pacific to New Zealand and Australia. There may be more efforts that are required to allow for those kinds of relocations, given the inequities of countries through no fault of their own, finding it increasingly challenging for their territories to remain habitable. There are wider efforts that are likely needed to lead to conflict resolution if there are increased challenges associated with transhumans and pastoral populations that need to move periodically for grazing lands. So trying to reduce those risks of conflict between sending and receiving populations is going to remain another challenge. But there's still a lot we don't know in this space.